Children barely 7 years old, torn away from everything they know, thrust into a system designed to strip away weakness and forge living weapons. A civilization where infants judged unworthy never see their first sunrise, abandoned on cold mountain peaks. A place where the words citizen and warrior mean exactly the same thing, where adolescents stalk the darkness with only a blade, ordered to hunt down and kill enslaved people to prove they deserve to exist. Where a captive population outnumbers their captors 10 to 1, living in perpetual fear because their masters formally declare war on them annually, not to conquer, but to terrorize. This isn't some dystopian fiction or fantasy world. This was Sparta, the most militarized civilization humanity has ever witnessed. For generations, they represented the pinnacle of warfare, Greece's ultimate defenders. Fighters so terrifying that enemies would lay down arms at the mere sight of crimson cloaks and lambda-marked shields advancing in flawless synchronization. Yet their fanatical devotion to military supremacy would ultimately prove their undoing. Their greatest victory would plant the seeds of catastrophic destruction. Welcome to the full chronicle of Sparta, where the relentless pursuit of martial perfection forged both the most feared army the ancient world had ever witnessed and orchestrated the spectacular disintegration of an entire way of life. Before we embark on this extraordinary expedition through one of humanity's most captivating societies, hit that subscribe button and activate notifications. You'll definitely want to catch the remarkable historical deep dives we're preparing. Now, let's discover how a tiny Greek settlement became mythology incarnate, then witnessed everything crumble into dust. Sparta's story doesn't begin with glory. It begins with invasion and brutality. In the rugged, mountainous territory of Laconia in Greece's southeastern Peloponnese, sometime around the 10th century BC, Dorian Greek invaders swept down from the north and carved out their settlement in the fertile Eurotas River Valley. The land was rich, the climate mild and Mediterranean, but this fledgling community confronted a challenge that would define every aspect of its existence and alter world history forever. They were encircled by hostile neighbors, sitting atop prime agricultural territory, vastly outnumbered. Their response was extreme, merciless, and would metamorphose them into something unprecedented in the ancient world. The Spartans, or Spartiates, their self-designation, turned their gaze westward toward neighboring Messenia, a region blessed with some of Greece's most productive farmland. The Messenians were wealthy, their fields abundant, completely unaware of the storm approaching. Between roughly 735 and 715 BC, the Spartans unleashed the First Messenian War, a savage conquest campaign spanning 2 brutal decades. This wasn't some brief raid or swift victory. It was 20 years of relentless warfare, village after village, field after field, methodically forcing the Messenians backward until nowhere remained to flee. The climax arrived at the fortress of Ithome, a natural stronghold atop Mount Ithome that the Messenians had fortified as their final refuge. For years the Spartans besieged it, unable to breach the defenses, yet refusing to abandon their goal. When it finally succumbed through starvation and exhaustion, the Spartans had achieved something almost unheard of in the Greek world. They didn't merely defeat their neighbors, they enslaved an entire people. Not individual captives taken in battle, but a complete population, men, women, children. The Messenians became helots, state-owned agricultural servants, bound to the soil, forced to cultivate the land and surrender half their harvest to their Spartan overlords. It was a foundation constructed on subjugation, and it would haunt Sparta for its entire existence. Consider the implications. Overnight, the Spartans doubled their territory and acquired a massive workforce. They could now dedicate themselves entirely to warfare because others were producing their sustenance, tending their fields, performing all the labor that typically consumed a Greek citizen's existence. Yet victory carried a terrible price and an even more terrible anxiety. The Spartans suddenly found themselves drastically outnumbered in their own homeland. Historical evidence suggests Helots outnumbered their Spartan masters by perhaps 10 to 1, possibly more. This wasn't merely a demographic challenge, it was an existential terror. How do you rest peacefully knowing the people cultivating your fields, serving your meals, living all around you, surrounding you on every side, have every justification to end your life? How do you maintain authority when you're so outnumbered that if they ever unified and rose up, they could annihilate you in a single night? The answer would transform Spartan society into something the world had never witnessed, a city-state that was simultaneously a military encampment, a surveillance state, and a revolutionary social experiment. But first, the Spartans would discover just how horrifying their situation truly was. The Spartans' darkest fears materialized around 660 BC, when, during a moment of Spartan military vulnerability following defeats in conflicts with neighboring Argos, the Messenian Helots erupted in a massive, coordinated rebellion. The Second Messenian War exploded with shocking ferocity, and it nearly obliterated Sparta entirely. This wasn't some minor disturbance or isolated uprising. This was full-scale warfare for survival, and for 2 decades the outcome remained genuinely uncertain. The Helots had been orchestrating this for years, awaiting their opportunity. They had concealed weapons, selected leaders, prepared strategy. When they struck devastatingly. Spartan villages were overwhelmed in the darkness, isolated garrisons massacred. The Helots fought with the desperate intensity of people who'd been enslaved for generations and understood that failure meant extermination. And they possessed a leader, a man whose name would become legend, Aristomenes. Aristomenes was a Messenian aristocrat who had somehow escaped complete subjugation during the First Messenian War. He was magnetic, tactically brilliant, and utterly committed to liberating his people. Contemporary records describe him performing almost superhuman achievements. He allegedly raided Sparta itself repeatedly, even infiltrating the city at night and leaving his shield in Athena's temple as proof of his presence, mocking the Spartans' inability to prevent him. He won engagement after engagement against Spartan forces, employing guerrilla tactics and intimate terrain knowledge to transform Spartan military advantage into liability. According to later Greek narratives, Aristomenes was captured and thrown into a deep ravine called the Kyadas, the same location where Spartans disposed of criminals and weak infants. But instead of perishing, he discovered a fox that had also fallen in, followed it through a narrow passage, and escaped. Whether factual or not, the story reveals how he became a folk hero, a resistance symbol that terrified the Spartans. Here was a Helot, someone they dismissed as barely human, humiliating the supposedly superior Spartan warriors. For 20 brutal years the conflict raged. The Spartans couldn't suppress the rebellion. They summoned allies from other Greek cities, but the Messenians, fighting on their homeland for their freedom, were nearly unstoppable. The Spartans suffered defeat after defeat. They attempted to storm the refortified Ithome and were repulsed with heavy casualties. They attempted to blockade it and discovered the Messenians could still obtain provisions. They were exhausting options, and their citizen population was bleeding out. The turning point arrived not through military genius but through attrition and betrayal. After 2 decades of continuous warfare, the Messenians were depleted. Aristomenes, despite his near-mythical status, was only one person and couldn't be everywhere. Some Helot cities began surrendering, their populations scattered or enslaved, others betrayed from within. Gradually, methodically, the Spartans crushed the rebellion, not through a single decisive battle, but through years of grinding siege warfare and brutal reprisals. When Ithome finally fell again around 640 BC, the Spartans demonstrated calculated mercy to some but strategic calculation to others. Aristomenes and many rebels were permitted to flee into exile rather than face execution, probably because the Spartans wanted this nightmare conflict to end, and couldn't afford to slaughter every fighting-age Messenian when they needed laborers. But they ensured the surviving helots understood rebellion's cost. Reprisals were savage. Entire villages that had supported the revolt were eliminated. The survivors were marked, monitored, and terrorized. The trauma of this decades-long struggle, the constant terror of being overwhelmed by a slave revolt, seared itself into the Spartan psyche like a brand that would never fade. When they finally crushed the rebellion, when the last insurgents had been killed or expelled, the Spartans understood with absolute clarity that their current system was unsustainable. They had barely survived. If the helots ever rose again with that level of coordination and leadership, the Spartans might not be fortunate. They couldn't afford weakness ever again. They couldn't permit internal dissent, luxury, or anything that might soften their warrior edge. They needed to transform their entire society into a permanent military apparatus, forever vigilant, forever prepared, forever hard. They needed to become something beyond human. They needed Lycurgus. Enter Lycurgus, the semi-mythical lawgiver whose reforms would create the legendary Sparta. Was he an actual person? Historians continue debating this. Some believe he was a genuine Spartan noble who lived in the 7th century BC and implemented radical reforms. Others believe he's a mythological figure, a composite of multiple reformers whose changes were attributed to a single legendary founder to grant them greater authority. What we know with certainty is that sometime after the Second Messenian War, probably mid-7th century BC, a revolutionary set of laws and social reforms swept through Sparta, transforming it completely and utterly. The changes were so radical, so comprehensive, so unlike anything in the Greek world that they were attributed to divine authorization. As tradition recounts, Lycurgus didn't simply decide one day to rewrite Spartan society. He journeyed to the Oracle of Delphi, the most sacred site in all Greece, where Apollo's priestess spoke prophecies. There he received Apollo's blessing for his reforms, the god himself approving these laws. This granted them religious authority that couldn't be questioned without committing sacrilege. Brilliant political strategy wrapped in divine mandate. The Great Retra, the celebrated proclamation of these reforms, restructured Spartan society from foundation to summit. But the political changes, though significant, were only the beginning. What Lycurgus did to Spartan social existence was revolutionary to the point of being almost inconceivable. He attacked the very foundations of Greek existence, the things every other Greek city held sacred: private wealth, family bonds, and individual ambition. According to tradition, Lycurgus redistributed all Spartan land equally among the citizens. Every Spartiate family received an equal plot of land, a kleros, worked by helots. The produce from this land would support the Spartan citizen and his family. This immediately created theoretical equality. A Spartan king's family had the same economic foundation as a common soldier's family. But Lycurgus didn't stop there. He knew that over time wealth would concentrate again through inheritance, commerce, and accumulation. So he attacked wealth at its foundation. He banned the use of gold and silver currency. Consider how revolutionary this was. Gold and silver were the basis of all Greek commerce, all trade, all wealth accumulation. Instead, Sparta would use only iron bars, deliberately made heavy and cumbersome. Here's the crucial twist. These iron bars were tempered in vinegar, making them brittle and worthless. They had no intrinsic value and couldn't be used outside Sparta. Imagine attempting to purchase something from a foreign merchant with a heavy iron bar that would shatter if struck too hard. This made foreign commerce almost impossible and wealth accumulation pointless. You couldn't become wealthy in Sparta because there was nothing to become wealthy with. Luxury goods, elaborate structures, fancy clothing, jewelry, conspicuous consumption, forbidden. Spartan houses could only be constructed with simple tools, axes and saws, nothing more, ensuring they remained modest and austere. Every Spartan, from the poorest citizen to the kings themselves, was expected to live with stark simplicity. Your house couldn't be elaborate, your clothing couldn't be expensive, your food couldn't be fancy. The only arena for competition, the only path to status and respect, was through military excellence and battlefield courage. Everything else was stripped away. Most revolutionary of all was the creation of the syssitia, the communal military mess halls. Every Spartan male citizen from age 30 until death, regardless of wealth or status, was required to dine together in these public messes. About 15 men per syssitia, eating the same simple, famously terrible food. The most notorious dish was the black broth, made from pork blood, vinegar, and salt. Classical writers tell us a visitor from another Greek city tried it once, and declared he now understood why Spartans were so willing to die in battle, because life wasn't worth living if you had to consume that every day. But the food wasn't the point. The syssitia served multiple purposes. They promoted equality because everyone ate the same meal. They discouraged luxury because fancy food and wine were forbidden. They built military camaraderie because you dined with your battle companions every single night, forging bonds stronger than family. And most importantly, they removed men from their private homes and family influence. A Spartan man didn't come home for dinner. He ate with his military unit. His primary loyalty wasn't to his family, it was to his fellow soldiers and to the state. The state came before everything, before family, before personal ambition, before comfort, before life itself. Failure to contribute your monthly share of food and goods to your syssitia meant expulsion from the mess, and expulsion from the mess meant loss of citizenship. You became a hypomaean, an inferior, someone who had failed the Spartan ideal. You lost all political rights, couldn't participate in the assembly, couldn't hold office, and carried shame that marked you for life. For a Spartan, this was a fate worse than death. The message was clear and absolute. The collective comes before the individual always. But like Kyrgyz's most enduring and terrifying legacy, the thing that would make Sparta's name echo through history was the creation of the Agoge, the brutal state education and military training system that would transform Spartan boys into the finest warriors the ancient world had ever witnessed. This was not education as we understand it. This was not about reading poetry or studying philosophy. This was a calculated program of physical and psychological brutality designed to eliminate weakness and forge human weapons. The Agoge began before a child was even born. Spartan women were encouraged, even required, to maintain physical fitness during pregnancy, exercising and training to ensure they would bear strong children. When a Spartan infant entered the world, it didn't go directly to its mother's embrace. It was immediately taken for inspection by the elders, experienced warriors who examined every infant for signs of weakness, deformity, or sickness. Imagine being that father, watching old men examine your newborn child, knowing they possess the power of life and death. If they decided your baby was too weak, too sickly, had any deformity, or simply didn't appear robust enough, the infant was taken to the apotheke, a chasm on Mount Taygetus. There it was abandoned to die of exposure. No burial, no funeral, no mourning, just abandoned to perish because it wasn't deemed worthy of consuming Spartan resources and might weaken the citizen body if permitted to live. This practice, shocking to modern sensibilities and disturbing even to other Greeks who learned about it, was viewed by Spartans as necessary culling. They justified it with cold logic. Sparta couldn't afford to waste resources on weak children who would never become effective soldiers. Every mouth to feed had to be a potential warrior. It was brutal, it was merciless, and it reveals everything you need to understand about Spartan priorities. The state's military needs came before every human instinct, even parental love. For the boys who passed this first brutal test, childhood was brief but not quite as harsh as what was approaching. Until age 7, they lived with their families. However, even this brief period was not gentle or soft. Spartan mothers, unlike their counterparts in Athens or other Greek cities, were not tender nurturers focused on comfort and affection. They were instructed to raise their sons to be hard, to ignore pain, to never complain, to display no weakness. Crying was punished, showing fear was mocked, asking for comfort was met with disdain. Spartan mothers had a reputation throughout Greece for their severity and their absolute commitment to military values. A well-known tale tells of a Spartan mother who had 5 sons fighting in a battle. When a slave returned from the battlefield, she didn't inquire if her sons were safe, she asked if Sparta won. When told yes, she said, "Then I am content," and only then asked about her sons. When she learned 4 had died but 1 survived and Sparta had won, she went to the temple to thank the gods. The story might be embellished, but it reveals what Spartans valued: victory for the state above all, even above the lives of your own children. The most famous Spartan maternal saying was the one Queen Gorgo, wife of King Leonidas, reportedly spoke to her husband before he departed for Thermopylae. "Come back with your shield or on it." The meaning was clear: return victorious carrying your shield, or return dead carried on your shield by your comrades. Retreat, survival through cowardice, dropping your shield to run faster. These were not options. Death before dishonor always. At 7 years old, the real Agoge began, and childhood ended completely. The boys were taken from their families and organized into age group companies called Agelai, meaning herds, as if they were animals being domesticated. From this moment, their lives belonged to the state. They lived in communal barracks with dozens of other boys, sleeping on beds they had to construct themselves from reeds they pulled from the riverbank with their bare hands. No mattresses, no blankets beyond their single cloak, no comfort whatsoever. The boys were deliberately underfed. They weren't starved to death's edge, but they were kept constantly hungry, lean and mean. The food they were given was barely sufficient to survive. This was intentional. The goal was teaching them resourcefulness, teaching them to fend for themselves. So they were encouraged, even expected, to steal food. Raiding farms, sneaking into storehouses, taking from the syssisha, whatever it required to supplement their meager rations. But here's the twist that reveals the Spartan mindset. If a boy was caught stealing, he was savagely whipped, not for stealing, but for the incompetence of being caught. The crime wasn't theft, it was failure, clumsiness, lack of cunning. If you were skilled enough to steal and escape detection, you were praised for resourcefulness. If you were caught, you were punished for being foolish and weak. This taught cunning, stealth, and the understanding that victory justifies everything, but failure earns only punishment. A legendary anecdote illustrates this perfectly. A Spartan boy stole a fox and concealed it under his cloak. While standing in formation, the fox, panicked and trapped, began to claw and bite into his stomach. The boy stood there, maintaining perfect military bearing, not making a sound, not moving, while the fox literally disemboweled him. He died standing in formation rather than admit he'd been caught with stolen property. When the instructors discovered what happened, they held him up as an example of perfect Spartan discipline. He had endured unbearable agony without complaint. This is what they wanted: boys who would rather die than show weakness. The training was relentlessly physical. Every single day involved constant wrestling, boxing, javelin throwing, discus competitions, and running. The boys ran barefoot over rough terrain, strengthening their feet until they could march 50 miles in a day without complaint. They wrestled in the dirt until their bodies were covered in bruises and scars. They boxed without gloves until their faces were pulp. They threw javelins until their arms felt like they would detach. And through it all, they were never allowed to complain, never allowed to quit, never allowed to show pain. They were exposed to the elements, given only a single red cloak regardless of season. In the brutal Greek summer, they sweltered in the heat. In winter, when temperatures in the mountains could plunge below freezing, they had only that thin cloak. No fires for warmth, no shelter beyond basic barracks. This taught them to endure heat and freezing cold without complaint, to function effectively in any weather, any condition. A Spartan warrior could fight in a blizzard or under the scorching sun with equal effectiveness, because he'd been conditioned from childhood to ignore environmental discomfort. They learned to dance, but these were not graceful, artistic dances. These were war dances, the Pyrrhic dances that taught coordination, unit cohesion, and battle formations while armed with shields and spears. Dancing in perfect unison with 50 other boys, maintaining formation, moving as one unit, these skills translated directly to phalanx warfare, where breaking formation meant death. They learned to read and write, but only the bare minimum. Spartans valued deeds over words, actions over philosophy. They learned enough to read military orders and write reports, but elaborate education in poetry, mathematics, or philosophy was considered useless, even dangerous. It might make them think too much, question too much. Better to keep them simple and focused on one thing: war. Spartans spoke little, and when they did speak, their words were brief and sharp. Lycurgus supposedly said that Spartans should speak so little that their words had weight, giving us the word laconic from Laconia, meaning brief and to the point. When Philip II of Macedon sent a message threatening Sparta with destruction if he invaded, listing all the terrible things he would do, the Spartans sent back a one-word reply: if. That's laconic wit, devastating, brief, fearless. Pain tolerance was cultivated through ritualized brutality. One infamous rite involved boys being whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia, the goddess of the hunt. This wasn't a light symbolic whipping. This was savage, brutal flogging, sometimes to the point of death, while the boys competed to see who could endure the longest without crying out. Blood flowed freely, boys passed out from the pain, some died from the beating or from infections afterward, and through it all they were expected to remain silent, faces impassive, showing no weakness. Tourists from other Greek cities, from Athens, Corinth, and Thebes, would come to Sparta specifically to watch this spectacle. They would sit in specially constructed viewing areas and watch young boys being whipped until they bled, horrified and fascinated in equal measure. To other Greeks, this was barbaric, shocking, almost inhuman. To Spartans, it was necessary. Pain was inevitable in war. A warrior who couldn't endure pain was useless. Better to eliminate the weak early and steel the strong through suffering. The boys who showed weakness, who cried or begged for mercy, were marked with shame that would follow them for life. They would be mocked by their peers, excluded from positions of leadership, and struggled to be accepted into a good syssisha when they came of age. Weakness was the ultimate sin, worse than cowardice, worse than failure. A Spartan could fail and redeem himself through future courage, but a Spartan who showed weakness, who complained, who cried out in pain, could never fully erase that stain. At age 12, the training intensified. The boys were now young men, and expectations rose accordingly. They were expected to find older male mentors, esteemed warriors in their 20s or 30s who would guide their development. These relationships, common in Greek military culture, served multiple purposes. The older warrior taught the younger one advanced combat skills, tactics, and the realities of battle. In return, the younger man provided companionship and would fight with desperate fury to protect his mentor in battle. These bonds created relationships of loyalty that extended beyond blood family to military brotherhood. Your mentor became more important than your father. Your age cohort became more important than your siblings. The boys were also introduced to the Crypteia, a secret police force that remains one of Sparta's darkest and most controversial institutions. The Crypteia was both a final test for the Agoge and a tool of state terror. The word itself means secret or hidden, and it perfectly describes this shadowy institution. Selected young Spartans, usually around age 20 and considered the most capable, ruthless, and ideologically committed, were chosen for the Crypteia. Being selected was an honor, a sign you were destined for leadership and greatness. But what they were asked to do reveals the absolute moral bankruptcy at the heart of Spartan society. Members of the Crypteia were sent out into the Laconian and Messenian countryside, armed only with a knife, sometimes a short sword. They carried no armor, no supplies, nothing that would identify them or slow them down. They traveled at night, hiding during the day, moving through the countryside like ghosts. Their mission was simple and horrifying: hunt and kill helots. Not random helots, they targeted specific ones. The strong, the intelligent, the natural leaders, anyone who might organize resistance or lead a revolt. These were the helots who worked hard, who were respected by their communities, who showed initiative and intelligence. Those were the dangerous ones. Those had to die. Every autumn, in a ceremony that made this legal, Sparta's ephors, the 5 annually elected magistrates, would formally declare war on the helot population. This wasn't metaphorical. It was an actual declaration of war, making the helots enemy combatants and rendering their deaths legal under Spartan law and acceptable under Greek religious customs. You couldn't just murder people without religious pollution, without angering the gods, but enemies killed in war. That was acceptable, even praiseworthy. So the young men of the Crypteia would slip into helot villages at night, identify their targets and kill them. A knife in the dark, quick, silent, efficient. The body would be found the next morning and the message was clear: we are watching you, we can reach you anytime, resistance is death. The psychological impact was devastating. The helots lived in constant terror, knowing that speaking out, showing leadership, or being too successful would mark you for death. It kept the population cowed and submissive, too afraid to organize, too terrorized to resist. But the Crypteia served another purpose equally dark. It desensitized young Spartans to killing. War isn't just about physical training and tactics. It's about the psychological ability to take another human life. Most humans have a deep, instinctive resistance to killing other humans. Soldiers throughout history have struggled with this, freezing in combat, shooting to miss, suffering psychological trauma from killing. Sparta couldn't afford that. Their warriors needed to be able to kill without hesitation, without remorse, without psychological damage. So they trained them to kill as teenagers in controlled circumstances against victims who couldn't fight back. You hunted a helot, you killed him, and you learned that killing was easy, that it didn't have to bother you, that you could do it and move on. By the time a Spartan faced an enemy soldier in battle, he had already killed. The psychological barrier was gone. He could fight with the ruthless efficiency that made Spartan warriors so terrifying. It was state-sponsored murder as both training exercise and political tool, and it reveals the utter darkness at the heart of Spartan society. They built their greatness on the backs of enslaved people, and they maintained that system through constant, systematic terror and violence. The helots weren't just oppressed, they were hunted for sport and murdered by the very men who depended on their labor. This remains one of the most morally reprehensible institutions in ancient history, and it was central to how Sparta functioned. At age 20, if a young man had survived the Agoge, proven his worth in the Crypteia, and been accepted into a Syssitia, he became a full citizen soldier, a Spartiate. But his life was still not his own. He lived in the barracks, devoted every day to military training, and was expected to marry and father children to produce the next generation of warriors. But here's the twist: he couldn't live with his wife until age 30. He had to marry, usually when he was around 20 and his wife was 18 or so, but he couldn't move in with her, couldn't establish a household, couldn't have a normal family life. He still lived in the barracks with his military unit. If he wanted to see his wife, he had to sneak away at night, visit her briefly, and return before dawn before anyone noticed he was gone. Some Spartans reportedly became fathers multiple times before they ever saw their wives in daylight. This sounds insane, but it had a purpose. It prevented men from becoming too attached to family life, too comfortable in domestic routines. Their primary identity had to remain as warriors, as members of their military unit. Family was secondary. Only at 30, after a decade of marriage and military service, could a man finally live with his wife and family. Even then, he still ate dinner at his syssisha every night and spent most of his day training. This system had an unexpected consequence. Spartan women enjoyed far more freedom, respect, and power than women anywhere else in the ancient Greek world. While women in Athens were essentially property, confined to their homes, forbidden from owning property, receiving minimal education, and expected to be silent and obedient, Spartan women were educated, physically trained, economically powerful, and outspoken. Think about it. Spartan men lived in barracks, ate at communal messes, and were constantly away training or at war. Someone had to run everything else. That someone was Spartan women. They managed estates, controlled agricultural production, made economic decisions, and effectively ran domestic society. And they were prepared for this. Girls didn't go through the Agoge, but they received education and physical training. They learned to read, write, and do mathematics. They exercised, ran races, and trained to be physically fit because Spartans believed that strong women bore strong children. Ancient sources report that Spartan women controlled approximately 40% of all land in Sparta. How? They could inherit property equally with men, and since so many Spartan men died in war without male heirs, property often passed to daughters and wives. Over time, enormous wealth concentrated in the hands of Spartan women, giving them economic power that was absolutely unprecedented in the Greek world. They could speak freely, even to men, even offering advice on military and political matters. There are recorded instances of Spartan women openly criticizing their husbands, mocking cowards, and praising the brave. When one Spartan woman was asked by a foreign visitor why Spartan women were the only women who could rule men, she supposedly replied, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." That's Spartan female confidence and pride. Queen Gorgo, wife of King Leonidas, is perhaps the most famous Spartan woman. She was highly educated, politically savvy, and respected enough that men sought her counsel. Ancient historians recorded that Gorgo, as a young girl, warned her father King Cleomenes not to trust a foreign envoy who was trying to bribe him. She saw through the man's deception when the adult male advisors didn't. Later, when Persia was preparing to invade Greece, the Greeks received a blank wax tablet from an ally in Persia. It appeared to be nothing, just a writing tablet with no message. But Gorgo figured it out. The message had been written on the wood beneath the wax layer, then covered with wax to hide it. When they scraped away the wax, they found the warning that Xerxes was coming. Her intelligence potentially saved Greece. And of course, there's her famous farewell to Leonidas. "Come back with your shield or on it." A Spartan woman's role wasn't to weep and beg her husband not to go to war. It was to demand he fight bravely and return victorious or die trying. That was love in Sparta, expecting your husband to risk death for the state and being proud when he did. The result of this entire system, the Agoge, the syssisha, the crypteia, the role of women, all of it, was the most formidable infantry force in the ancient world. Spartan hoplites were professionals in an age of citizen militias. While other Greek city-states fielded farmers and merchants who trained part-time, maybe a few weeks a year, Spartans were full-time warriors who lived for battle. They trained every single day, perfecting the techniques of phalanx warfare until they could perform them instinctively, even in the chaos and terror of battle. Their discipline was legendary. In battle, when other Greek armies charged in chaotic mobs, shouting and screaming, Spartans advanced in perfect silence, maintaining flawless formation, stepping in unison to the sound of flutes. They sang paeans, hymns to the gods as they marched into death. This created an eerie, terrifying spectacle. Hundreds of men in blood-red cloaks, shields emblazoned with the Greek letter lambda for Lacedaemon, advancing in perfect unison, silent except for the flutes and hymns, utterly disciplined and seemingly fearless. Their courage was unmatched because they had been conditioned from childhood to value honor above life. Death in battle was glorious. Survival through cowardice was shame worse than death. This created warriors who would choose death over breaking formation, rather die than retreat, rather die than fail their comrades. For over 2 centuries, Sparta would field what was effectively an unstoppable military machine, and the Greek world was about to see just how terrifying that machine could be. The true test of the Spartan system, the moment when their warrior culture would be validated before all Greece and echo through all human history, came in the early 5th century BC when the Persian Empire, the largest and most powerful empire on earth, set its sights on conquering Greece. The Greco-Persian Wars would provide the stage for Sparta's greatest military triumphs and cement their reputation forever as Greece's supreme warriors, the defenders of Hellenic freedom. When Persian King Darius the Great sent his forces to punish Athens for supporting a revolt in his empire, it was Athens that faced the invasion's brunt, alone at Marathon in 490 BC. The Athenians requested Spartan assistance, and Sparta agreed to send troops, but they were delayed by a religious festival, the Carnia, which forbade military campaigns. By the time the Spartan army arrived, Athens had already won a shocking victory, defeating the Persians through brilliant tactics and desperate courage. But Sparta's absence, even though for religious reasons, created a sense of shame, a feeling they needed to redeem themselves, to prove their supremacy when the Persians inevitably returned. That return came 10 years later in 480 BC, and this time it was overwhelming beyond imagination. Xerxes, Darius's son, had spent 4 years preparing the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history. Ancient sources describe an army exceeding 1,000,000 men, though modern historians estimate it was probably between 200,000 and 300,000, still an absolutely massive force for the ancient world. His engineers bridged the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe, with boats lashed together, creating a pontoon bridge that his army crossed for 7 days and 7 nights. His soldiers supposedly drank entire rivers dry. His navy numbered over 1,000 ships. This was the Persian Empire at the height of its power, and it was coming to conquer Greece and transform it into just another Persian province. Tiny Greece, a patchwork of constantly feuding city-states who could barely agree on anything, faced total annihilation. In this moment of supreme crisis, they did something unprecedented. They united. And when they needed to choose a military leader for this desperate alliance, they turned to Sparta. Athens had the larger fleet and more ships, but when it came to land warfare, there was only one choice. Sparta was given supreme command of all allied Greek ground forces, recognition of their military expertise, their reputation, and the simple fact that no one else could lead armies like the Spartans could. The strategy was clear. You can't defeat a force that outnumbers you 10-1 in an open field battle. You need terrain, bottlenecks, places where numbers don't matter. The Greeks chose 2 places to make their stand: the narrow pass of Thermopylae on land and the narrow straits near Artemisium at sea. If they could hold both, the Persian numbers would be meaningless. If either position fell, Greece was doomed. King Leonidas, one of Sparta's 2 hereditary kings from the Agoge royal house, personally volunteered to lead the force defending Thermopylae. This itself was unusual. Spartan kings rarely led small expeditionary forces. They led main armies. But Leonidas had consulted the oracle of Delphi, and the prophecy had been dark. Either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king would die. Leonidas understood what this meant. This was a suicide mission, and it required a king to give it the weight it needed. So he took command personally. He selected his personal bodyguard, 300 elite Spartiates, all men over 30 who had living sons to continue their bloodlines. This detail is crucial. These weren't random soldiers. They were veteran warriors in their prime, every single one a father, ensuring their families would continue even after they died. They knew this was likely a one-way trip, and they went anyway, proudly, because dying for Sparta was the highest honor a Spartan could achieve. They were joined by about 7,000 other Greek allies, soldiers from Thebes, Corinth, Thespiae, and other cities. It was a respectable force, but nothing compared to what was coming. The pass of Thermopylae was a perfect defensive position. It was only about 50 feet wide at its narrowest point, flanked by steep mountains on one side and cliffs dropping to the sea on the other. An army of hundreds of thousands would have to attack through a space barely wide enough for a few dozen men to fight side by side. Numbers meant nothing here. Tactics, discipline, and training meant everything, and in those qualities the Greeks, particularly the Spartans, were superior. When Xerxes arrived and saw the Greek force blocking the pass, he couldn't believe their audacity. Ancient historian Herodotus tells us that Xerxes sent scouts forward, and they reported something bizarre. The Spartans were outside their wall, some exercising, others calmly combing their long hair. Xerxes, confused, asked a Greek exile what this meant. The man explained. Spartans comb their hair before battle, preparing to die beautifully. They were getting ready to fight to the death, and they were doing it with such calm they might as well have been preparing for a festival. Xerxes waited 4 days, expecting the Greeks to lose their nerve and flee. They didn't move. On the 5th day, enraged at their defiance, he ordered the attack. The Medes, tough warriors from the Persian heartland, advanced first. They poured into the pass, thousands of them, and crashed into the Greek phalanx. And they died, in droves, in waves, helplessly. The Persians, armed with shorter spears, lighter shields, and less armor, couldn't reach the Greek hoplites to strike them. The Greeks, with their longer spears, bronze armor, and massive hoplon shields, were like an iron wall. The Persians pushed forward and were speared. They tried to flank, and there was nowhere to go. They tried to overwhelm with numbers, but the pass was so narrow that only the front rank could fight, and they were cut down. Bodies began to pile up. Xerxes, watching from a throne he had set up on a nearby hill, saw his army accomplishing nothing but filling the pass with corpses. According to Herodotus, he jumped from his throne 3 times in rage and terror, watching the carnage. This wasn't supposed to happen. His army had conquered everything in its path. These were just a few thousand Greeks. How were they holding? For 2 full days the battle raged. The Persians attacked in waves, and every wave broke against the Greek phalanx. Xerxes sent his elite troops, the Immortals, 10,000 elite Persian warriors who were the empire's finest. They fared no better. The Spartans and their allies fought in rotating shifts, staying fresh, replacing tired men with rested ones, maintaining their formation and discipline while the Persians exhausted themselves. A celebrated exchange captures the Spartan spirit perfectly. When told that the Persian arrows would be so numerous they would block out the sun, a Spartan warrior named Dionysus supposedly replied with a laugh, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." This was quintessential Spartan laconic wit. Facing impossible odds, death certain, respond with dark humor and absolute confidence. Fear is weakness, and weakness is unacceptable. The Greeks were winning. Against all odds, a few thousand men were holding off the largest army the world had ever seen. If they could just hold on a bit longer, the Persian fleet might be destroyed at Artemisium, Xerxes might run out of supplies, the invasion might collapse. Victory was possible. And then came betrayal. A local Greek named Ephialtes, a man who would become the most infamous traitor in Greek history, approached Xerxes seeking reward. He revealed a mountain path, a narrow track called the Anapia path that wound around the mountains and would allow the Persians to outflank the Greek position and attack from behind. Xerxes immediately sent the immortals to march through the night and get behind the Greeks. The Greeks had posted a force of Phocian soldiers to guard that path, but the Persians scattered them easily in the darkness. When scouts brought word to Leonidas at dawn that the Persians were coming from behind, he understood immediately. They were about to be surrounded and annihilated. The strategic position was lost. The mission was over. The smart thing, the logical thing, would be to retreat immediately, save the army to fight another day. Leonidas made a different decision. He dismissed most of the Greek allies, sending them to safety to fight another day. But he and his 300 Spartans would remain. They were joined by 700 Thespians who absolutely refused to leave, and 400 Thebans who may have been hostages or may have volunteered, depending on which source you believe. But the core of the force that stayed was the 300 Spartans. Why stay? Why choose certain death? Because Leonidas understood something crucial. This battle was no longer about holding the pass. It was about sending a message. If the Greeks retreated without fighting, it would look like cowardice. It would discourage the other Greek cities. They might give up, might surrender, might decide resistance was hopeless. But if the Spartans stayed and fought to the last man, making the Persians pay in blood for every inch of ground, it would inspire all Greece. The Spartans would become martyrs, heroes, a rallying cry for resistance. Their death would matter more than their life. And there's another factor. Spartan law forbade retreat. The Spartan military code, drilled into them since childhood, demanded that you hold your position or die. Retreating was unthinkable. So for Leonidas and his 300, staying wasn't really a choice. It was simply what Spartans did. The final stand at Thermopylae is one of the most storied last stands in all military history. On that third morning, knowing they were doomed, knowing the Persians were coming from both front and rear, Leonidas and his men prepared for death. They advanced further out from their wall than before, taking the fight to the Persians in the wider part of the pass. They weren't defending anymore. They were attacking, trying to kill as many Persians as possible before they died. Ancient sources tell us they fought in waves, first with their spears until every spear shattered, then with swords until every sword broke, and finally with their bare hands, clawing and biting and fighting like animals. The discipline was gone, replaced by desperate fury. Leonidas himself fell in the thick fighting early on, and a desperate battle erupted over his body as the Spartans tried to protect their king's corpse, and the Persians tried to claim it as a trophy. 4 times the Spartans drove back Persian forces and recovered the body. When the Persians coming from the rear finally arrived and the trap closed, the surviving Spartans and Thespians fell back to a small hill within the pass, making their last stand in a tight circle. They were surrounded by thousands of Persians who had learned not to get close to these fanatics who fought like demons. So the Persians stood back and filled them with arrows, shooting them down from a distance rather than face them hand to hand. When the arrows finally stopped and the dust settled, every Greek defender was dead. Xerxes, still enraged, ordered Leonidas's body found. When they dragged it from the pile of corpses, Xerxes had it beheaded and crucified, an almost unheard-of dishonor in Greek culture that showed how much the Spartan king had frightened and humiliated him. But the dishonor only made Leonidas more of a martyr. The Persians had won the battle, but at what cost? Historical accounts give wildly different casualty figures, but modern estimates suggest the Persians may have lost 20,000 men taking that pass. 20,000 dead to defeat 7,000 Greeks. And they had been delayed for 3 precious days, days that allowed the Greek fleet to withdraw safely to Salamis, days that gave Athens time to evacuate its population, days that gave all Greece time to mobilize and unite. And most importantly, the 300 had given Greece a story, a legend, a symbol of resistance that would inspire every Greek soldier from that day forward. More importantly, Leonidas had given Greece something armies need to win wars: belief. The Persians could be beaten. They could bleed. They could die. The myth of Persian invincibility was shattered, replaced by the myth of Spartan invincibility. The 300 became immortal. The poet Simonides composed an epitaph for the Spartans at Thermopylae that would be carved on a stone and become one of the most celebrated epitaphs in history. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. Simple, direct, powerful. They had done their duty. They had obeyed Spartan law. They had died as Spartans should, in battle, standing their ground, never retreating. What more need be said? The delay at Thermopylae allowed the Greek fleet, under the brilliant Athenian commander Themistocles, to withdraw to the island of Salamis near Athens. Xerxes, enraged and determined to finish the Greeks quickly, advanced south, burning Athens to the ground in revenge for Marathon. The Athenian population had evacuated to Salamis and other nearby areas, and they watched their city burn, wondering if all was lost. But Themistocles had a plan. He understood that Xerxes needed a quick victory. The Persian king had left his army in hostile territory with supply lines stretching back thousands of miles. Winter was coming. He couldn't afford a long campaign. He needed to destroy the Greek fleet, break Greek resistance, and secure his conquest before his massive army ran out of supplies. And Themistocles was going to give him exactly what he wanted, or at least make him think he was. Themistocles sent a secret message to Xerxes, pretending to be a traitor. The message claimed that the Greek allies were about to flee, sailing away in different directions, and that if Xerxes attacked immediately, he could trap and destroy them. It was a complete lie, but Xerxes believed it. Why wouldn't he? He had just won at Thermopylae. The Greeks seemed on the verge of collapse. This was his chance to end the war in one stroke. Xerxes ordered his fleet, numbering perhaps 600 to 800 ships after losses at Artemisium, to enter the narrow straits of Salamis and block both exits, trapping the Greek fleet. He even had a throne set up on a nearby hill so he could watch his navy destroy the Greeks and enjoy the spectacle. What he didn't know was that he was sailing into a trap. In September 480 BC, the Battle of Salamis began. The Persian fleet sailed into the narrow straits and suddenly found themselves in chaos. The straits were too narrow for them to maneuver effectively. Their ships bunched together, colliding with each other, unable to use their superior numbers. The Greek fleet, numbering around 370 ships but with crews that knew these waters intimately, attacked. The Greek triremes, sleek war galleys with bronze rams on their prows, rode at full speed and smashed into the crowded Persian ships. Bronze rams punched through wooden hulls. Ships capsized. Men drowned by the thousands, weighed down by armor and unable to swim. In the chaos, the Persians, trapped in the narrow waters, couldn't retreat, couldn't maneuver, couldn't bring their superior numbers to bear. It was Thermopylae in reverse, with the Greeks using terrain to negate Persian numerical superiority. Xerxes, watching from his throne, witnessed his supposedly invincible navy being torn apart. Ship after ship went down. The water turned red with blood. Bodies floated everywhere. The Greeks, inspired by the sacrifice at Thermopylae and fighting for their homes and families, fought with desperate fury. By the end of the day, the Persian fleet was shattered. They had lost perhaps 200 ships and tens of thousands of men. The Greek losses were minimal in comparison. This was the turning point of the entire war. Xerxes, sitting on that throne, watching his dreams of conquest literally sink before his eyes, understood that everything had changed. Without a fleet, he couldn't supply his massive army. He couldn't protect his line of retreat across the Hellespont. If the Greeks sailed there and destroyed his bridge of boats, his entire army would be trapped in Greece and could be starved into submission. He had no choice. Xerxes withdrew, taking most of his army back to Persia and leaving his best general, Mardonius, with a picked force of perhaps 100,000 men to finish the conquest. Mardonius was talented, experienced, and absolutely confident he could defeat the Greeks. He had elite Persian troops, cavalry superiority, and the wealth of the empire to bribe Greek cities into betraying the alliance. He spent the winter of 484–79 BC trying to split the Greek alliance, offering Athens incredibly generous terms if they would switch sides. But Athens refused. They would rather see their city burned again than submit to Persia. In the summer of 479 BC, the largest Greek army ever assembled, perhaps 100,000 hoplites from all the allied city-states, gathered to face Mardonius. And leading this army was Pausanias, the Spartan regent acting on behalf of Leonidas's young son. The stage was set for the final decisive battle of the Persian Wars. The armies met near the city of Plataea in Boeotia. For days they maneuvered, neither wanting to attack uphill or across unfavorable terrain. Mardonius had his cavalry constantly harassing the Greek lines, cutting off their water supply, trying to force them into a disadvantageous position. The Greeks were struggling with supply issues and were considering withdrawing to better ground. But then Mardonius made his mistake. Thinking the Greeks were retreating in disorder during a night repositioning, he ordered a full attack. His Persian troops, elite warriors who had conquered most of the known world, advanced confidently. They formed a wall of wicker shields and poured arrows into the Greek lines. This was how Persians fought: missile weapons, mobility, shock. It had worked from India to Egypt. It didn't work against Spartans. The Spartan phalanx, fighting on the right wing as was their place of honor, stood firm under the arrow storm. Their bronze armor and large shields protected them from the worst of it. Then, when the moment was right, they advanced. The Spartans began their hymns, the flutes played, and they moved forward in perfect formation, an unstoppable wall of bronze and iron marching into the Persian lines. The Persians fought bravely. They grabbed at Spartan spears, trying to break them. They threw themselves against the shields, but they were fighting the most disciplined infantry force in the world, men who had trained their entire lives for exactly this moment. The Spartan phalanx was like a machine, relentless and merciless. They pushed forward, spears stabbing, shields bashing, stepping over Persian dead and pressing deeper. In the thick of the fighting, Mardonius himself, mounted on a white horse and surrounded by his elite Persian guard, led a desperate counterattack. And there, in the chaos of battle, a Spartan warrior named Arimnestos hurled a stone that struck Mardonius in the head, killing him instantly. The Persian general who had terrorized Greece for a year, who had burned Athens twice, died in the dirt, killed by a thrown rock. With their commander dead, the Persian center collapsed. The entire Persian army began to retreat, and the retreat became a rout. The Greeks pursued, cutting down the fleeing Persians by the thousands. The Persian camp was overrun, its treasures looted, and its defenders massacred. Historians report that of the Persian force, perhaps only 40,000 escaped. The rest were dead or captured. On the same day, legend holds, the Greeks won another victory at Mycale in Asia Minor, where the Greeks destroyed the remnants of the Persian fleet that had been beached and fortified. The Persian invasion of Greece was over, ended by Greek unity and Spartan military prowess. The Persian Wars made Sparta's reputation complete and total. They were the saviors of Greece, the elite warriors, the defenders of freedom against tyranny. Their courage at Thermopylae, their discipline at Plataea, and their unwavering commitment to never surrender made them legends, not just in Greece, but throughout the Mediterranean world. Sparta had reached the absolute pinnacle of its power and prestige. For the next several decades, no one would question Spartan military supremacy. They were the hegemon, the leader, the power that other Greek cities followed. But it was from this height that they would begin their long, tragic fall. Because the very qualities that made them great, the rigid social system, the complete focus on military excellence, the ruthless suppression of the helots, were also making them brittle, inflexible, and slowly dying from within. We're about to see how Sparta's greatest strengths would become fatal weaknesses, and how the warriors who saved Greece would ultimately be destroyed by their own system. But first, if you're captivated by this story of ancient warriors and their dramatic rise, show some love by hitting that like button. It really helps us bring you more epic historical content like this. Now let's see how it all fell apart. In the decades following the Persian Wars, Sparta stood at the zenith of its power. They led the Peloponnesian League, a coalition of allied city-states across southern Greece that gave them enormous military and political influence. Their system seemed vindicated, proven by victory against the greatest empire on earth. But beneath the surface of this golden age, deep structural problems were already eating away at the foundations of Spartan power, flaws inherent in the very system that had made them great. The first and most critical problem was demographic collapse. The Spartan system was built on an extremely exclusive citizenship. Only those who completed the Agoge were accepted into a syssitia and could afford their contributions could be full Spartiates with political rights and military duties. But this citizen body was small and shrinking at an alarming rate. At Sparta's peak around 480 BC, there were perhaps 8,000 to 9,000 adult male Spartan citizens. This was already a tiny number compared to Athens, which had perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 citizens. But the Spartan numbers kept falling. By 479 BC at Plataea, Sparta could field 5,000 Spartiates. By 418 BC, they could field perhaps 3,500 to 4,000, and the decline accelerated from there. Why? War took its toll. Despite Spartan skill, every Spartan who died in battle was irreplaceable because producing a new one took 30 years of training, survival through the brutal Agoge, and acceptance by a military mess. And Spartans were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Battle of Sphacteria in 425 BC, where Athens captured 120 Spartan prisoners, was considered a catastrophe, not because of the number, but because every single one of those 120 men represented an irreplaceable loss. Earthquakes made things worse. In 464 BC, a massive earthquake struck Sparta, killing thousands, including a large number of Spartan citizens. Some sources claim 20,000 people died total, though that number might be exaggerated. But what's certain is that significant numbers of Spartiates died, and the Helot population saw this as their opportunity. They immediately revolted, starting the Third Messenian War, forcing Sparta to fight a decade-long struggle to suppress the rebellion, while their citizen numbers were already depleted. But the most insidious cause of demographic decline was economic. Despite Lycurgus's ideals of equality, over time wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Here's how it worked. A Spartiate needed to contribute monthly to his syssitia, food and goods worth a certain amount. This came from the produce of his land, worked by helots, but land was passed down through inheritance, and with each generation, estates could be divided among heirs or sold to pay debts. Over time, some families accumulated more land while others lost it. And here's the crucial detail. Spartan women could inherit and own land. This was revolutionary and progressive in the Greek world, but it had an unintended consequence. Women didn't have to pay syssitia contributions. They could hold onto their wealth, while men who lost their land or couldn't afford contributions lost their citizenship. If a Spartiate couldn't make his monthly contribution to his mess, he was expelled and became a hypomaion, an inferior. He lost all political rights, couldn't vote in the assembly, couldn't hold office, and was excluded from the full citizen body despite having completed the Agoge. He was Spartan by training and culture but not by legal status, and there was no way back. Once you lost citizenship, you couldn't regain it. By the mid-4th century BC, ancient sources like Aristotle report that perhaps 2/5 of all Spartan land was owned by women. Meanwhile, the number of full Spartiates had fallen below 1,000 adult males. The citizen body was being hollowed out from within, not by war, but by their own economic system failing to maintain the equality Lycurgus had envisioned. This created a strategic nightmare. Sparta's entire military system was based on having enough Spartiates to field their phalanx, and critically, to keep the vastly more numerous Helot population suppressed through constant presence and terror. But as citizen numbers fell, they became increasingly overstretched. They had perhaps 100,000 to 200,000 Helots and Perioc, free but non-citizen inhabitants, to control with fewer and fewer Spartiates. Every man lost was a gap in their system that couldn't be filled. They couldn't afford to send large forces far from home for extended periods without risking Helot revolts. They couldn't afford casualties in foreign wars. They couldn't afford to risk their precious remaining citizen body. They became increasingly conservative, defensive, and paranoid. They started using Perioc and even freed Helots in their armies, diluting the elite Spartiate corps that had made them feared. The second major flaw was cultural and strategic inflexibility. The Spartan system, designed in the 7th century BC for a specific purpose, had become rigid and unchangeable. Lycurgus's reforms had been elevated to religious status, and any suggestion of change was seen as corruption, betrayal of Spartan values. Yet the world around Sparta was changing rapidly, and they refused to adapt. Athens represented everything Sparta was not. Where Sparta was closed and isolationist, Athens was cosmopolitan, trading with the entire Mediterranean. Where Sparta discouraged wealth, Athens embraced commerce and became fabulously rich, using that wealth to build the largest navy in Greece. Where Sparta limited citizenship, Athens gradually expanded it. Where Sparta was intellectually stagnant, Athens became the intellectual capital of Greece, home to philosophers, playwrights, artists, and scientists. Socrates, Plato, Sophocles, Euripides, all Athenian. Sparta produced soldiers, nothing else. Most dangerously for Sparta, Athens transformed the Delian League, originally an alliance against Persia, into the Athenian Empire. Hundreds of cities across the Aegean paid tribute to Athens, filling its treasury and funding its massive fleet. By the middle of the 5th century BC, Athens and Sparta represented two completely different visions of Greek civilization, and they increasingly viewed each other as existential threats. The First Peloponnesian War from 460 to 445 BC was a series of conflicts and proxy wars that ended in an exhausted stalemate and a treaty supposed to last 30 years. It lasted barely 15. Both sides used the peace to prepare for the inevitable final showdown. The spiral toward total war had begun, and it would tear the Greek world apart. In 431 BC, the fragile peace shattered, and the Great Peloponnesian War began. For the next 27 years, Greece tore itself apart in a conflict that devastated the entire peninsula. It was a clash of everything: Sparta's invincible land army against Athens's unbeatable navy, oligarchy against democracy, discipline against creativity, tradition against innovation. The brilliant Athenian leader Pericles understood that Athens couldn't defeat Sparta in a land battle. The Spartan phalanx was still the deadliest fighting force in Greece. So he adopted a defensive strategy that made brilliant sense on paper. Abandon the Attic countryside. Bring everyone behind Athens's long walls connecting the city to its port of Piraeus, and use the navy to import food, raid Spartan territory, and maintain the empire. Athens, protected by its walls and supplied by sea, would outlast Sparta. The Spartans could ravage Athenian territory all they wanted, but they couldn't take the walls and couldn't stop the navy. For the first years of the war, this strategy worked, but at a terrible human cost. The Spartan king Archidamus led his army north every summer and systematically destroyed the Athenian countryside. Farms were burned, olive groves were cut down, crops were destroyed. It was economic warfare designed to force Athens to come out and fight. But Athens refused, staying behind its walls while its fleet raided the Peloponnesian coast. Then disaster struck Athens in a form no one anticipated: plague. In 430 BC, with the entire rural population of Attica crammed into Athens for protection, a devastating epidemic swept through the overcrowded city. Modern historians aren't sure what disease it was, possibly typhus or typhoid fever, but whatever it was horrifically lethal. The death toll was catastrophic. Perhaps a quarter to a third of Athens's population died, including Pericles himself in 429 BC. But Athens endured. Their democracy was resilient enough to survive losing its greatest leader. They had younger, more aggressive leaders ready to take over, and they still had their fleet and their empire. The war became a savage, grinding affair that destroyed the old conventions of Greek warfare. Cities that had been neutral for generations were forced to choose sides. Entire populations were massacred or enslaved. The Spartans slaughtered Athenian prisoners. The Athenians destroyed entire cities like Melos for refusing to join their empire. The war produced moments of shocking Spartan vulnerability. In 425 BC, Athenian forces trapped a Spartan garrison of 420 men, including 120 full Spartiates, on the island of Sphacteria. After a brief siege, the Spartans surrendered rather than fight to the death. This shocked the entire Greek world. Spartans had surrendered. Spartans, who were supposed to fight to the last man, who came back with their shield or on it, had actually surrendered to save their lives. The truth was that by this point, every single Spartan citizen was so valuable, so irreplaceable, that Sparta couldn't afford to lose 120 of them for the sake of honor. The myth was cracking, showing the demographic crisis beneath. Athens held those prisoners hostage, threatening to execute them if Sparta invaded Attica. It worked. Sparta was paralyzed by the fear of losing those precious citizens. But Athens made mistakes too. In 415 BC, at the height of its power, Athens launched a massive expedition to conquer Sicily, sending thousands of soldiers and over 200 ships to besiege Syracuse. It was a disaster. The Sicilian expedition ended in 413 BC with total annihilation. Nearly the entire Athenian force was destroyed or captured. Thousands of Athenians died in Sicilian quarries, used as slave labor by their captors. It was the worst defeat Athens had ever suffered. Sparta, seeing Athens weakened, did something that would have been unthinkable to Leonidas. They made a deal with Persia, their old enemy. In exchange for Persian gold to build a fleet and Persian support, Sparta agreed to abandon the Greek cities of Asia Minor to Persian control. It was a complete betrayal of everything they had fought for in the Persian Wars, the freedom of all Greeks from foreign domination. But they were willing to sacrifice principle for victory. With Persian gold, Sparta built a fleet. They found a brilliant admiral, Lysander, who understood naval warfare and politics equally well. Lysander systematically destroyed Athens's empire, city by city, cutting off their tribute and strangling their economy. The final blow came in 405 BC at Aegispotami in the Hellespont. The Athenian fleet, 180 ships carrying the last of Athens's military power, was beached on the shore. Lysander, who had been shadowing them for days, attacked at dawn when the Athenian sailors were ashore looking for food. It was complete surprise. The Athenians tried to reach their ships, but it was too late. Lysander captured or destroyed nearly the entire fleet in a one-sided massacre. 3,000 Athenian prisoners were executed on Lysander's orders. Athens was now defenseless. Sparta besieged the city by land while their new fleet blockaded it by sea. No food could get in. The population began to starve. For months Athens held out, hoping for a miracle, but none came. Finally, in April 404 BC, Athens surrendered unconditionally. The long walls were torn down to the music of flutes and celebration. Sparta's allies wanted to destroy Athens completely, enslave its population, and salt the earth. But Sparta refused, saying that Athens had done too much for Greece during the Persian Wars to deserve annihilation. It was perhaps the last moment of Spartan nobility. They had won. After 27 years of war, Sparta stood supreme over Greece, the undisputed hegemon, the victors of the greatest war in Greek history. Yet it was a hollow, poisoned victory. The war had devastated the Greek world. Entire cities were destroyed, generations were dead, treasuries were empty. And Sparta, the victor, was perhaps the most damaged of all. Their citizen body had been further depleted by decades of warfare. Numbers that had been around 3,000 to 4,000 Spartiates at the war's start were now perhaps 2,000 to 2,500. And they now ruled an empire they were utterly unequipped to manage. The Spartan system had been designed for a small, closed society defending a specific territory, not for administering a complex network of hundreds of allied and subject states. They didn't have enough citizens to garrison cities. They didn't have the administrative expertise to manage tribute systems. They didn't have the diplomatic skills to balance competing interests. And worst of all, they had become corrupted by the very wealth and power they had won. Spartan governors abroad, far from the austere control of Sparta, became tyrannical and corrupt. They hoarded gold and silver, the very things Lycurgus had banned. They lived in luxury. They abused their power. The cities that had welcomed Sparta as liberators from Athenian imperialism quickly discovered that Spartan rule was worse. Athens had at least been honest about its imperialism. Sparta was hypocritical, preaching about freedom and Greek autonomy while crushing anyone who challenged them. And they had betrayed the Greeks of Asia Minor to Persia, the same Persians Leonidas had died fighting. The moral authority Sparta had earned at Thermopylae was utterly destroyed by Lysander's cynical deal. Within a decade, Sparta found itself fighting former allies in the Corinthian War, with Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos all united against them, funded by Persian gold. The Persian king, playing Greek city-states against each other with masterful manipulation, had switched sides, now funding Sparta's enemies. Sparta was exhausted, overstretched, and running out of manpower. The Greek world had descended into endless, pointless war with no winners, only losers. And then came Thebes, and everything changed forever. The true beginning of Sparta's end came not from its old rival Athens, but from Thebes, a city they had long dominated and dismissed as second-rate. Following the Corinthian War and the king's peace brokered by Persia in 386 BC, Sparta had imposed harsh terms on its enemies. But Thebes, proud and resentful, chafed under Spartan domination. In 382 BC, Sparta took the extreme step of seizing the Theban citadel, the Cadmea, and installing a pro-Spartan oligarchic government. It was a blatant violation of the peace terms and revealed Sparta's hypocrisy. They claimed to fight for Greek freedom while brutally suppressing any city that challenged them. But in 379 BC, Theban exiles led a daring coup. They infiltrated the city disguised as women attending a festival, assassinated the pro-Spartan leaders at a banquet, and sparked an uprising that expelled the Spartan garrison. Thebes was free, and it had tasted Spartan blood. Under two brilliant generals, Epaminondas and Pelopidas, Thebes began to rebuild its military. But they didn't just copy other Greek cities, they innovated. Pelopidas created the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit of 150 pairs of male lovers. The theory was that men would fight with exceptional courage to protect their lovers, refusing to show cowardice before the person they loved most. It proved devastatingly effective. The sacred band became the most feared elite unit in Greece, fanatically brave and superbly trained. But Epaminondas's real innovation was tactical. He studied Spartan warfare and identified its weakness. Traditional Greek phalanx battles were formulaic. Both armies lined up, strongest troops on the right wing, because shields were carried on the left arm, and both right wings would typically win their engagements, then wheel around to attack each other from behind. It was predictable, almost ritualistic. Epaminondas decided to break the rules completely. He would mass his best troops on his left wing in an unprecedented formation, 50 ranks deep compared to the traditional 8 to 12 ranks. This massive column, led by the sacred band, would smash into the Spartan right wing, where the Spartan king and the elite Spartiates always fought. Meanwhile, the rest of his line would refuse engagement, holding back at an oblique angle, not even attacking until the left wing had done its work. It was revolutionary, asymmetrical warfare that completely violated every convention of Greek battle. In 371 BC, at the plain of Leuctra in Boeotia, Epaminondas got his chance to test his tactics against the army that had been undefeated in pitched battle for over 200 years. King Cleombrotus of Sparta led approximately 10,000 troops, including about 700 full Spartiates, one of the largest concentrations fielded in decades. They expected a conventional battle. They expected victory. They were walking into a revolution. As the armies deployed in the early morning, the Spartans noticed something strange about the Theban formation. The left wing was absurdly deep, almost a square formation rather than a line. But they had fought hundreds of battles and never lost. Why would they lose now? They advanced confidently. When Epaminondas gave the order, his massed left wing, the sacred band at its tip like a spear point, charged directly at the Spartan right. The collision was catastrophic. The Spartans suddenly found themselves not just outnumbered, but completely overwhelmed by the weight and momentum of 50 ranks of hoplites pushing behind the first few ranks. It was like being hit by a battering ram. The Spartans, the men who'd been taught since childhood never to break, never to retreat, tried to hold. They pushed back, spears stabbing, shields slamming, but the physics were impossible. The Theban column, with its massive weight and momentum, pushed forward inexorably. The Spartan phalanx, only 12 ranks deep, began to buckle. King Cleombrotus, fighting at the front as Spartan kings always did, was struck down and killed in the opening clashes. His death sent shockwaves through the Spartan ranks. For men who had been taught their entire lives that Spartans were invincible, that they never lost, that their kings were descended from Heracles himself, seeing their king fall in the first minutes was psychologically devastating. The Spartan right wing, the elite core of the army, began to collapse. Men who had never retreated in their lives started to fall back. As they gave ground, the entire Theban line swept forward, the previously held back center and right now advancing and hitting the Spartan left. The Spartan allies, seeing the elite Spartiates themselves in full retreat, broke completely. The battle became a rout. When the fighting ended, 400 Spartiate citizens lay dead on the field. 400, more than half the entire Spartan contingent. It was the single greatest loss of Spartan lives in a single battle in Spartan history. Worse than Thermopylae, because at Thermopylae they had chosen to stay and die. At Leuctra, they had fought to win and lost anyway. The news of Leuctra sent shockwaves through all Greece like an earthquake. The myth of Spartan invincibility, the foundation of their power for 2 centuries, the thing that made enemies surrender at the sight of red cloaks, was shattered in a single afternoon. Spartans could lose, Spartans could be outfought, Spartans could be beaten. And if Spartans could lose, then everything was possible. Thebes was now the dominant military power in Greece. Yet Epaminondas wasn't done. He understood that defeating Sparta in one battle wasn't enough. You had to destroy the system that produced Spartan warriors. So he did something no one had dared to do in over 300 years. He invaded Laconia itself. In 370 BC, and again in 369 BC, Epaminondas led Theban armies deep into the Peloponnese, not just raiding, but actual invasion with the goal of permanent territorial conquest. He marched right up to the city of Sparta itself, something no enemy had done since the Dorian invasion centuries earlier. Sparta had no walls, never needed them, always relied on their warriors to be their walls. Now those warriors couldn't stop the Theban advance. The city descended into chaos. Old men and women who had never seen an enemy army in their lives watched Thebans march through their territory. Sparta actually mobilized the Helots, armed them, and promised them freedom if they fought. Thousands accepted, which reveals how desperate the situation was. Epaminondas didn't attack the city directly, because besieging an urban area without proper walls was difficult and costly. But he didn't need to. He had a different target. Epaminondas marched west into Messenia and did something that changed everything. He liberated the Helots. After over 300 years of slavery, after generations of brutality and terror, after living under the constant threat of the Crypteia, the Messenian Helots were free. Epaminondas helped them rebuild their ancient capital city of Messene and fortified it with massive walls, some of the finest defensive fortifications in Greece. In one stroke, Sparta lost half its territory, most of its agricultural base, and the labor force that had supported its entire system. Think about what this meant economically. Spartan citizens didn't work their own land, Helots did. Spartan citizens trained for war full-time because someone else was growing their food. Now half those Helots were gone, free citizens of an independent Messenia. The remaining Spartan citizens had to work reduced land themselves or hire labor. But that meant no time for full-time military training. The entire economic foundation that had allowed the Agoge and the Syssitia to function was destroyed. Epaminondas also established the Arcadian League and built Megalopolis, great city, a massive fortified city in the heart of the Peloponnese. It was populated by Sparta's former Arcadian allies, now united against them and protected by enormous walls. Sparta was now surrounded by hostile fortified cities, Messene to the west, Megalopolis to the north, Argos to the northeast. The Peloponnesian League, which had existed for centuries and made Sparta the hegemon of Greece, dissolved. Sparta's territory was reduced to just Laconia, a fraction of its former extent. The demographic crisis reached catastrophic levels. By the mid-4th century BC, the number of full Spartan citizens had fallen below 1,000, perhaps as low as 700. Think about that. From 8,000 to 9,000 at the time of the Persian Wars to fewer than 1,000 a century later. The entire system that had made Sparta great required a large citizen soldier class to maintain constant military readiness and Helot suppression. With only a few hundred citizens, that system was no longer viable. Sparta tried desperate measures. They created new citizen categories, allowed Perioc and freed Helots to fight in the phalanx alongside the dwindling number of Spartiates, and even hired mercenaries. These were band-aids on a mortal wound. Sparta without a large Spartiate class was just another Greek city-state, and not a particularly important one. The failure wasn't just military or economic, it was systemic and cultural. Sparta's rigid social system, its refusal to adapt, its prohibition on trade and wealth accumulation, its brutal suppression of a massive enslaved population, all of it had made them simultaneously powerful and brittle. When that brittleness was tested, when the demographic base eroded and the military mystique broke, The entire structure collapsed with shocking speed. The society that had seemed eternal, unchangeable, divinely ordained, proved to be the most fragile of all. Following Leuctra and the liberation of Messenia, Sparta entered a long, painful twilight. They were no longer a great power, no longer relevant to the major conflicts shaping Greece. The new powers were Thebes, then Macedon under Philip II, then his son Alexander the Great. Sparta was a has-been, living on past glories while the world moved on without them. When Philip II of Macedon unified Greece under his rule in the 340s and 330s BC, he devastated Spartan territory but never directly conquered the city. There's a legendary exchange that captures Sparta's new status. Philip sent a message. "You are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city." The Spartans, displaying a flicker of their old laconic wit, sent back a one-word reply: "If." Philip did invade Laconia, ravaged it thoroughly, stripped away more territory, and gave it to Sparta's enemies. But he never besieged Sparta itself. Some say it was respect for their history. More likely, it was because they simply weren't worth the effort. They were already broken, already irrelevant. Why waste time conquering a city that posed no threat? When Alexander the Great demanded troops for his conquest of Persia, every Greek city sent soldiers, except Sparta. They refused, citing their tradition of never serving under foreign command. It was a matter of pride, the last gasp of Spartan exceptionalism. Alexander, busy conquering the known world from Greece to India, didn't bother to punish them. He just ignored them. That's how far they had fallen, from the saviors of Greece to not even worth Alexander's attention. Some Spartan kings tried radical reforms to restore the old system. King Agoge IV in the 240s BC attempted to redistribute land and restore Lycurgus's equality, canceling debts and trying to expand the citizen body. The conservative oligarchs, the wealthy elite who had concentrated land in their hands, had him arrested and executed. His successor, King Cleomenes III, tried similar reforms in the 230s and 220s BC with temporary success, briefly expanding the citizen body and winning some military victories. But he was ultimately defeated by a coalition of his enemies and died in exile in Egypt. These reform attempts revealed the fundamental problem. The old system couldn't be restored because the conditions that created it no longer existed. The helots were free, the land was gone, the demographics were shattered, and any meaningful change threatened the interests of those who still held power. Sparta was trapped between a past it couldn't recapture and a future it refused to embrace. The final chapter of Sparta's story came with Rome's expansion into Greece in the 2nd century BC. By this time, Sparta was ruled by tyrants and strongmen, the old political system long since abandoned. In 195 BC, the Romans fought a brief war against the Spartan tyrant Nabis. The Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus besieged Sparta with an army of 50,000 Roman legionaries and Greek allies. Nabis, seeing the hopeless odds, surrendered quickly. Sparta was stripped of its remaining coastal territories, forced to pay war reparations, and reduced to a tiny territory around the city itself. In the following decades, Sparta was absorbed into the Achaean League, a confederation of Greek cities that was itself subordinate to Rome. When the Romans conquered Greece completely in 146 BC, Sparta became just another subject city in what would become the Roman province of Achaea. By the time of the Roman Empire, Sparta had become a tourist attraction. Romans, fascinated by ancient Greek culture, and particularly by Sparta's legendary warriors, would visit to see the descendants of Leonidas's people. They watched young Spartans being whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia, but now it was theater, a performance for tourists, not genuine military training. The ancient customs were maintained as heritage tourism, not living culture. The Roman Emperor Caracalla visited in the early 3rd century AD and was so enamored with Sparta's mythical past that he created a new military unit called the Laconian Phalanx. But these were just regular Roman troops given a prestigious name. The real Sparta, the Sparta of Lycurgus and Leonidas and Thermopylae, was long dead, preserved only in memory and in the stories travelers told about a society that had once produced the greatest warriors the ancient world had ever seen. The rise and fall of Sparta is one of history's most profound cautionary tales. For over 2 centuries, they were the ultimate warriors, the defenders of Greece, a society so utterly focused on martial prowess that every aspect of life was subordinated to military excellence. They created a system that produced soldiers of renowned discipline, courage, and skill. They saved Greece from Persian conquest. They won the Peloponnesian War. They made their cities' names synonymous with military greatness for all time. But that same single-minded focus on military perfection became their fatal weakness. The brutal Agoge produced excellent soldiers but killed off weak children and created a shrinking population. The suppression of the Helots required constant violence and vigilance, making foreign wars risky and eventually impossible when demographics collapsed. The very things that made Sparta great made it incapable of surviving when the world changed. Sparta's story reveals something profound about power and civilization. Strength taken to an extreme becomes weakness. A society that values only one thing, even something as important as military power, builds on a foundation that can't last. When you build your entire civilization on the backs of enslaved people, when you sacrifice every other human endeavor for warfare, when you make your system so rigid it cannot adapt, you're creating something spectacular but fragile. And when the breaking point comes, the collapse is total and irreversible. The ultimate irony is that Sparta's greatest rival, Athens, though defeated in war, won in history. Athens gave the world democracy, philosophy, theater, and art that shaped Western civilization for millennia. We still read Plato and Aristotle. We still perform the plays of Sophocles and Euripides. Athenian democracy, however flawed, inspired political revolutions worldwide. What did Sparta leave? A few historic battles, a cautionary tale about militarism, and the word Spartan, meaning austere and harsh. Yet we remember them. We remember the 300 at Thermopylae standing against impossible odds. We remember the red cloaks and bronze shields advancing in perfect formation to the sound of flutes. We remember Lycurgus's radical reforms and the brutal Agoge. We remember because Sparta, despite its profound flaws and ultimate failure, represented something that still captures our imagination: absolute commitment, unwavering courage, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for something greater than yourself. They were extreme, brutal, built on slavery and violence, and ultimately doomed. But they were undeniably remarkable. Their story endures not because they were good, they often weren't, but because they were extraordinary. And that's why, more than 2,000 years after the last Spartan warrior died, we still tell their story. So what do you think? Was Sparta's system inevitably bound to fail, or could they have adapted and survived? Was their military excellence worth the brutal cost in human freedom and suffering? And what lessons can we draw from their rise and fall about how societies balance strength with flexibility, tradition with innovation, military power with everything else that makes civilization worthwhile? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This is the kind of discussion that makes history come alive. And if this epic journey through one of history's most fascinating civilizations kept you engaged from beginning to end, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're bringing you more incredible deep dives into ancient wars, fallen empires, and the battles that shaped our world. From Alexander the Great to the Roman legions, from ancient China to the Viking Age, we're covering it all with the same depth and drama you just experienced. Thanks for sticking with us through this massive documentary. History isn't just names and dates, it's the story of real people, real struggles, and real consequences that echo through the centuries. And Sparta's story, from their brutal rise to their spectacular fall, is one of the most compelling stories history has to offer. See you in the next video where we'll bring another chapter of history to life. Until then, remember, the past isn't dead. It's not even past. It shapes everything we are today.